Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us. I'm Andy Moore. I'm a partner at MSB and the head of ASB and Leasehold in our social housing team. And today I've got with me Andrew Fairman.
Hi everyone, hope everyone's well.
And Andrew, do you want to tell everyone what you do?
Yes, I'm a senior associate at MSB. I'm also the head of compliance, building safety and decarbonisation for social housing providers as well.
So internally, Andrew is known as our compliance guru. I think it's fair to say in relation to all the work that you do for our clients and your specialist knowledge that you've got in relation to building safety.
Yeah, it is. It's something I try to specialise in. I think it's a bit of a niche. I think we've seen over the last couple of years that it's gone on to become a bigger sector in its own right, and I think that's only going to go that way further forward as well.
Absolutely. So the topic we've got today is smoke and carbon monoxide amendment regulations.
Yes. So we had some new regulations come into force in 2022. They've actually come into force very recently. As of the 1st of October, this was something that was first mooted with the consultation that took place in early 2021, actually. So it's taken a little bit of time to come through, but I suppose by legislative standards, you could argue it's actually relatively quickly. The 2022 regulations ultimately bring in amendments to the existing regulations that were in place from 2015. Those regulations covered certain landlords, but didn't cover all landlords, and specifically for our purposes, it didn't cover social housing. Yeah. So for the last 7 years since they came into force in 2015, social housing registered providers haven't really had to do too much in terms of smoke alarms. Good practice may have indicated that they put certain smoke alarms in, but they're now going to be subject to specific regulations as well.
Okay. So in terms of, I think to benefit everyone who's listening to this really, what's the background to this being brought in?
Well, the background is a bit of a general compliance background as much as anything. It's not necessarily strictly limited to the sort of smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. It's more of one of the first pieces of legislation that we're seeing come in. We've obviously got elements of the Building Safety Act that are coming into play, although it's not all in force yet. We've got these regulations that come into force. There's currently a consultation on bringing in some electrical safety regulations for social housing as well. And it all seems to stem from, unfortunately, from the terrible incident that occurred at Grenfell. Mm-hmm. Since then, and following on from the inquiries, there have been several attempts to move the area of compliance further forward, and there's an element of trying to make tenants as safe as possible within their rented properties. And we see these regulations coming out of that general movement towards a much more tighter and a much stricter compliance regime from a regulatory viewpoint.
So at the core of it, it's all about tenant safety.
All about tenant safety. All about tenant safety. All the regulations that we'll see going will become all about tenant safety. They will all put more of an onerous and more of a positive duty onto landlords, and specifically onto social landlords as well, with that safety aspect at the core. You'll see other elements coming in as well in terms of tenant voice and tenants generally having more input into their own safety issues and safety matters, such that they've got their own rights to bring complaints and hold landlords to account.
So what do the new regulations introduce then? Well, as an overview?
As an overview, the actual regulations as they stand, the 2022 regulations, are not very user-friendly. That's the first thing to note. Mm-hmm. They are an amendment regulation. And unfortunately, what that means is it makes amendments to an existing regulation. So you find if you just want to sit down and look at what are our obligations, it's not that easy to say. No. Because you'd have to look at the 2022 regulations, which make amendments to certain regulations that existed from 2015 regulations, and you find yourself going back and forth with it. The key takeaways ultimately are that, firstly, it comes into force from the 1st of October 2022, so they're in force as matters stand. Mm-hmm. The key points are that in the previous regulations, it covered landlords, but it excluded social landlords.
Right.
That is now not the case. As of the 1st of October, social landlords are included. It also adds on the element of carbon monoxide alarms for all landlords, including private landlords as well as social landlords as well. It changes the definition of what a landlord is to include those registered providers, and then goes on to give the definitions of what they ought to do. The key points really are that for any property, you must have a smoke alarm fitted on each story of the premises where a room is used as accommodation. So you've got to have that in place as of the 1st of October. Then moving on to carbon monoxide alarms, the regulation reads that in any room that is used as accommodation where there is a fixed combustion appliance other than a gas cooker, and that phrase is quite important, you must have a carbon monoxide alarm fitted. The key one that springs to mind there is, of course, your gas boiler that most properties currently have, and other areas we may well discuss a move away from gas supply appliances such as your gas boilers. But for the time being, that's going to be a really important one, that you're going to have something in that room where there's a gas boiler. The interesting point there is that specifically there's an exclusion for a gas cooker. So the regulation doesn't make a requirement that if in each kitchen, for example, you must have a carbon monoxide alarm in that room. Other things to consider, of course, gas fires, things of that nature that some properties may have as well.
Is this going to be completely new for our clients?
It's not necessarily...
Or is it things that they've already been doing in a lot of cases, but perhaps haven't been regulated?
In terms of smoke alarms, I think that's definitely not something that's new. I think most social landlords, as good practice, would have smoke alarms. What it does introduce is a new element that you've got to have it on every floor. So it increases the onerous duty in terms of where they've got to be specifically. Carbon monoxide alarms, I would suggest, is a newer one. Some properties may have had it, some landlords may have given them to tenants in certain aspects, but now you've got this positive requirement to have it. It just increases the safety element from a landlord's perspective, and then increases the onerous duty on them. And of course, it comes with its own repercussions for non-compliance, essentially.
It's going to be interesting for them, and it's going to be a lot potentially for our clients to do as well, isn't it?
It's a lot of work, particularly for clients that have got a large amount of stock. You've got problems whereby we've had such things as the gas safety regulations in place since the late 90s, 1998. We still get issues getting into those properties to do an annual gas safety check, which only takes a few minutes. You're going to have them problems in properties where you've historically got hard access issues, then going in to get more and more things done in the property. Obviously, we've got electrical safety checks coming into play as well, now and in the future as well. The more and more we see new legislation coming in, the more and more need there is to gain access to properties. And with those hard access tenants that some landlords do have across their stock, that is where the problem is going to lie. For most of the stock, it's going to be okay. You're going to get compliance. Tenants will let you in, do the duty, do the works. There is an issue, obviously, with the cost that the landlord's got to do to get contractors in to fit all these. But you've then got the problem of ensuring that you've got it in every single property. And you can get through those ones that are hard access, which historically you've had issues with.
For our clients, we know from experience that most private / commercial landlords have very similar natures of stock, don't they? And that most properties are the same.
Yeah, by and large.
Our clients have a mix of the weird and the wonderful in terms of the stock that they've got. So are there any exemptions for particular types of properties?
There are some exemptions, which is an interesting point. You're quite right. We, as social landlords and as registered providers, they often do have a mixed bag of tenancies. Also, you've got shared ownership, you've got leasehold things, a whole vast array of arrangements in play. Generally speaking, the definition for what a tenancy is taken from the Energy Act, Section 150 of the Energy Act 2013. But there are exclusions to that. The definition ultimately is quite wide-ranging. It covers any lease, license, sublease or subtenancy. So it does cover the vast array of ones that we have, but it does provide a specific exclusion, interestingly, for long leases. And that's the key one that I think is a takeaway for social landlords clients. Those long leases are leases that generally are over 7 years. More often than not, for your shared ownership properties, things of that nature, those leases will be long-term leases. So for that element of it, that falls outside of these regulations.
Has that been specifically included?
It's been specifically
as named as shared ownership, because of course shared ownership leases are a bit different.
It has been excluded, yes, specifically, as long as it covers, as long as it defines a long-term lease and the tenant has the general ownership of that leasehold as well.
Okay. That's good to know that they specifically dealt with that. In terms of our clients not doing what they should be doing,
yes.
Is there any penalty for that?
There are repercussions. So the local authority has a positive duty to serve remedial notices on social landlords if there are elements of non-compliance with the regulations. Those can include fines of up to £5,000 per breach. So you could potentially have a scenario where you've got a breach of the smoke, breach of the carbon monoxide, and you could be getting multiple fines for one single property potentially. It is a new regulation. It remains to be seen how much that is enforced. The way the current regulations work are that once you are on notice and you've been provided with that notice of an issue of either it not being in place as it should be per the regulations, or also there's a positive duty to repair and or replace ones that aren't working, or there's a defect with or anything of that nature. Once you're on notice of that, you're supposed to repair that within a timescale that's reasonably practicable to do so.
Yep.
That, again, there's a little side of caution because there's no specific timescale. We've got the phrase that's reasonably practicable. Thereafter, if that isn't the case, the local authority can serve that remedial notice and fines can be enacted. And what the local authority are looking for there is that you've taken all reasonable steps to secure access to that property.
Well, that's the important thing that you just said, because
yes,
as you know, as I know, sometimes we can't get in.
Crucial. And the regulations actually cover that in terms of Regulation 6. It actually specifically states that you can be fined for not taking all reasonable steps or not bringing legal proceedings to secure the access to the property.
Well, that's new, isn't it?
Yes, that's something I've not seen before in a regulation itself. I mean, it's always been my view that, and particularly if you look at the gas regulations, for example, that contains a similar clause that you've got to take all reasonable steps. But it doesn't say that you must have brought legal proceedings.
Yeah.
In this, it does actually specifically cover that. And I think that gives us some definition of other regulations as well, to say that as a reasonable step, bringing those legal proceedings in order to secure access to a property to carry out whatever requirement is necessary.
I mean, it'll certainly make our job easier at court, won't it?
It certainly does.
to be able to say
we
that.
can simply point to it and say the regulation requires us to do this, and on we go. And we should therefore, we get home and dry in terms of obtaining. Your best way to do that is, of course, an injunction. And in terms of obtaining those injunctions, it just helps us get across the line straight away.
So injunctions is one way of doing it, and I suppose if you've got long-term non-compliance with these issues, the other alternative would be possession as well, wouldn't it?
Definitely. If you've got continual breaches, but I suppose the benefit of an injunction is that as a normal matter, of course, and most courts and most judges are agreeable, you can end up with an injunction for a longer period of time, up to the duration of the tenancy. So once you've got that injunction in place for one property, you would hope that would lead to compliance, and you can rely on that injunction year after year to continue to gain the access that you need, or each time you need to go in to repair or replace, particularly for the carbon monoxide and smoke alarms.
Of course, if they don't let you in, you're then looking at contempt of court proceedings against them.
You've got that element of it, haven't you? You've got the element of breach, and of course there's potential to use a forced entry clause on a variation of the injunction as well to guarantee you can be as compliant as possible, which could be seen as a slightly better way. It may be seen as more draconian in some eyes, but when you consider your other options, which is possession and someone losing their property, or committal and someone potentially going to prison, it maybe puts it in a bit more perspective, and it guarantees that you'll be able to get what you need done.
It does, doesn't it? Because I think it'd be an interesting position that we're in, that we've got regulations which say we should be taking legal action.
Yes.
And that potential legal action that we're taking is sending that tenant to prison. Well,
yeah, but it does say that we need to take that. What it does say is we need to take the action to secure the access to the property. If we've done that on a first basis and got the injunction, it follows to me that we must then follow that up and take next steps if the injunction hasn't worked. So as long as we're continually trying to do something, whether it be enforcement on an injunction order, if the injunction order hasn't worked, for example, then I think that continues those reasonable steps and keeps a landlord out of any difficulty in terms of non-compliance.
I think it does. It leads to that natural progression then, doesn't it? I think a lot of the time we'd probably look to not take contempt proceedings in injunction cases when it's a case for access. Ideally,
yes. The issue with contempt proceedings really is, whilst it's a good threat in terms of obviously someone could face going to prison, so it does offer that element where you're more likely to get compliance because of the potential outcomes. The difficulty is if there's still non-compliance, having the committal proceedings doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It doesn't get you into the property and doesn't solve the regulatory issue that you've got in terms of that requirement.
Yeah. So we've got this side of things, and the best action for our providers to take now.
The best action is to try and get into those properties and have a system of works in place as soon as possible. They have come into force on the 1st of October, but there has been an interesting comment from the social housing regulator, and the social housing regulator has essentially said that they expect social landlords to be compliant with these regulations from the 1st of October, or to have a system of works in place to show that they have a plan in place to ensure that they're mitigating the risk to any tenants. So if you can evidence that you've got a system in works in place and you are doing it in a reasonable timescale to ensure that any risk is mitigated to that tenant, then at the moment you won't fall foul of regulations as per the advice given from the regulator.
So it's action now, really.
It is very much action now. And if you don't have a plan of works in place, it is a case of getting a plan of works in place. And if you are in the midst of a plan of work and a system being in place, and you're coming up against those hard access properties, it's important to remember that you need to be looking to bring those legal proceedings as per the regulation that we've previously discussed.
It's a lot for them. So in terms of the regulations, Grenfell inquiry is obviously still ongoing.
Of course.
Is this going to be it now? Or is there more down the pipeline?
There's definitely more down the pipeline. I mean, if we look at what's in play at the moment, we've obviously had the Fire Safety Act come into force, albeit not in full effect yet, because it's linked to the Building Safety Act, which again has partially come into force. There's so many different elements coming into it. They're the big two that have come out. We've got these regulations that specifically move the goalposts in terms of a compliance world. You've now got a live consultation that is happening in terms of electrical safety regulations. They were obviously brought in for private landlords not too long ago, but there's no specific regulations for electrical safety checks, a requirement for them for social landlords. I've absolutely no doubt that they will come into force as regulations, and I think we'll see more development in terms of fire safety as well in the next sort of 12, 18 months. For me, it is clear that is where it's going, and compliance and the onus of compliance is going to be on social landlords. And I think what I've seen as well, if we look at the social housing white paper that was produced, a lot of it is moving towards a more positive duty on the landlord. So if you're in properties, for example, and you are highlighting issues, there's a positive duty for those landlords then to try and move on and fix those works. And it's not a case of, well, it wasn't reported, ignorance is bliss situation. It's going to become a much more, you were on notice, you've seen this, you must do it, or you're going to come foul regulations. So we're going to see a tighten up as well, I think, for those criticisms of landlords as well.
So there's a lot for our clients there, really, isn't there? There's lots for them to do. There's some good parts of the legislation for them in terms of trying to be able to enforce cases and to try and help with that access side of things, which tighten things up for them. So that's positive from that side of things.
I think the key takeaway is that there is going to be stronger regulatory requirements on them, but what we're seeing as a result, and there are elements of the Building Safety Act that we've seen as well that aren't in force yet, but there is clear parameters there for landlords to use tools at their disposal to ensure compliance. So we're getting stricter regulations, but we're getting a greater ability to get in and do those things that we need to do, and greater ability to assist landlords in compliance with it. And I think in the last few years, I've noticed, and I don't know your view on this, Andy, but I assume it's quite similar. The courts have become more sympathetic to compliance-based issues and are more willing to grant orders and grant things such as drill-out orders, which grant things such as forced entry clauses, which historically was not something that was easy to get.
They used to in the early days when I used to do the injunctions. They were very difficult to get at first, or some courts hadn't come across them at all.
I think that shows a cultural shift, doesn't it, that we've got in place since the unfortunate Grenfell incident.
Yeah, I suppose it's been progression, hasn't it? From we had our gas injunctions, then we started with our electrical injunctions as well to get access for it.
Yeah.
And then we're slightly coming back
Yeah.
back again to the fire side of things. But I think if there's good regulated background to it, then that's definitely going to help our clients.
Yeah, I'd agree. I definitely agree.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's everything for us. Hopefully that's been helpful. If anyone's got any queries, please do get in touch with Andrew, our compliance guru, and you'll be able to steer you in the right direction.
Thanks, Andy. Good to chat to you.
Good to see you too.